Today's November 13th, 2024, and a little bit later in the day in the UK. And of course, that's maybe an interesting metaphor for how things are going. You know, they used to have the atomic scientists used to have that clock, the doomsday clock for the planet. I don't know how your clock is going in the UK. Looks like we've managed to turn back the hands of time a little bit here. Maybe some of it will reach over. We'll get a penumbra effect. Daniel Jupp is a brilliant writer. He writes at Jupplandia. We'll show that a little bit later. He's written The Gates of Hell. And I can't remember some of the treason. I forget the other title. You'll tell us. And he is a brave and interesting interlocutor on the British scene. So Daniel, tell us UK. What you can about the UK? Is it united? Is it a kingdom?
It's barely anything at the moment, to be honest, other than a kind of an unacknowledged tyranny and a near Marxist republic. I mean, the UK is in a very bad position, in a very bad way, because we have a Labour government that only had the backing of about 20% of the population, but still has this massive majority that they earned supposedly at the last election. And they are a very radical, progressive globalist party. You know, just the kind of people who, in the Democrats in the US, have just been kicked out of office. And, you know, they've just come in. The Conservatives were globalist enough, but these guys are even worse. And, you know, they've immediately done multiple things that reduce the freedom and life chances and possibilities for decent life for ordinary people in the UK.
So let me just wave this one for a second. One point of order. You're having a little jiggle there. I don't know if there's something what you're filming with, but is it a table or something like that is moving around?
Yeah, it's on a little table. I hope it doesn't jiggle too much.
Well, if it could jiggle less, I think that will be less distracting. Because
I'll endeavour to reduce the jiggles.
Okay, so I'm going to just wave us back into reality here. So where does that leave us? I mean, you know, we broke away. We're kind of Adam's rib of the UK, and you know, we took some of the common law aspects to frame things, but we wrote this thing called the Constitution. You have like an unwritten Constitution, which I don't think is as good as having a written one, with ostensibly the preservation of minority rights. The parliamentary system seems to be, you know, democracy has a two-edged sword. Everyone wants to preserve democracy, save democracy, but they don't realize that democracy can have its own vision of viciousness, in a sense, insofar as it tramples over others. Maybe, you know, I'd like to hear, you know, through your voice and see through your lens and prism, what are the disparities between the way things are playing out in the UK and the USA, and whether we can have any reverberations, you know, backwards, you know, maybe some type of revolution or evolution in the UK based on the USA.
Well, I mean, the big difference, obviously, is that you have Trump, and you have a man who was prepared to risk his life to save his nation, you know, and someone who had the independent financial means to really fight back against the consensus of the liberal elites. And you also have, of course, the MAGA movement. And we don't have any equivalent of that in the UK. We do have a lot of people that voted for the Reform Party, and we do have Nigel Farage, but we don't have the kind of independent financial backing of those figures that poses a serious threat to the establishment. So that's the problem essentially for the UK. We haven't got the financial backing of patriotic movements that we need. We haven't got, for example, an Elon Musk or a Bobby Kennedy Jr. to bring into a kind of big tent of freedom-loving rebellion. We don't have that in the UK. And there's still quite a lot of systemic corruption that's never been acknowledged in the UK, whereas I think a lot of the boil was lanced by how bad things got in the US, and it became very obvious the degree of corruption that you had operating. Whereas in the UK, it was fairly obvious with Brexit and the opposition to Brexit, but we haven't had it lanced in that sense because, there's still a lot of people out there in the UK who are unaware of the extent to which there's an establishment that acts against their interests.
Do you think that continues, after Southport and Rotherham and, all the kind of protests and so forth? It seems like there is a movement of sorts, but it just gets cut off at the knees.
Well, that's when you look at the kind of Southport so-called riots, which were almost kind of used by the authorities in the same way that J6 was used in the US by the authorities to kind of close down all debate along those lines and close down freedom of speech and independent voices, and to kind of massive preventing riot and responding to riot. Really, it was just enforcing complete control over what people are allowed to say and think. And, as I said, we have a very difficult situation because we don't have any champions with independent power of the status of those that have emerged in the US.
So, Jean-Paul Sartre had his book Huis Clos, which is the infinity symbol. Here it's translated as no exit. I pass on the way to services a little condo village here. You might call it an estate or something, which has a big kind of brick sculpture, and there's a sign just for parking. It says no turnaround. It doesn't want people to go in and turn around there. But that sign was ominous for me for so many years under the censorship regime we had under Biden. It was like no turnaround, no turnaround. I'd see that weekly, and I felt weekly myself looking at it. And I'm wondering, do you see no turnaround? Do you see, any light?
I think there is signs of hope, and there is a possibility of rebellion. And Trump's election is incredibly useful for patriots, libertarians, dissidents everywhere else in the Western world, because all of the processes that were happening in the US have been happening in Europe and have been happening in the UK. And just a mere example that a political movement or a political leader can be the victim of an attempt at total destruction of him by the established powers and survive it, literally survive it with assassination attempts included, and get through it. And a nation can get to the point where it's got hope and possibility again, is a huge example for any kind of rebellion elsewhere. Because, we all face the same globalist pressures. We all face these vast networks of power, whether they come from individual billionaires like a Bill Gates or George Soros or his children, or whether they come from transnational bodies like the UN or the WEF. We all face the agenda that those people are pursuing. And, this sense that our democratic norms have been broken by those people who then talk about democratic norms being broken, but they're the ones who did it. And, that we've got no exit out of this. But America is now an example that there is an exit out of this if enough people get motivated and get responding to it.
So I saw a tiny clip of a parliamentary debate, and I love the way they kind of face off each other in such tight quarters. We don't have that here. Pronunciation of her last name, Badenoch, the current conservative leader.
Yeah, I believe it's pronounced Badenoch.
Thank you. She was up against what is his name, David Lammy. I don't fix the name for me.
Yes, David Lammy,
having insulted Trump and so forth. I'm wondering what you thought of that, whether you saw it, and what comes from that, if anything.
Well, look, it's a good sign that she was prepared to kind of embarrass him by referencing these old statements that David Lammy had made. Now, for American listeners who aren't familiar with who he is, David Lammy is a black British politician who for years really has been, the equivalent of one of our race grifters, essentially. And, like, as you're very familiar with in the US as well. And he's kind of advanced his career on the basis of supposedly representing the black community. And he's, was quite anti-police at one point. And he's, one of those people who will tend to characterize any disagreement with him as racism or any issue that involves crime statistics or anything else you want to think of as will be viewed through a racial lens by David Lammy. And that's where his background was. That was what he was doing through most of his career, and he was something of a joke in conservative circles, certainly, but also more broadly in the country, because he's not very articulate, he's not very bright, and he's basically got to the top of the tree in the Labour Party purely by pressing this, I'm a representative of the Black Voice of Britain agenda. He wasn't someone that you could expect a competent action from. His previous comments on Donald Trump are very in line with the sort of comments we hear from radical globalists all the time, which were that Donald Trump was a Nazi and a fascist and a sexist and a homophobe and a xenophobic person and all of that, and a racist, of course. And David Lammy was spitting this poison constantly. He's immediately reversed it as British Foreign Secretary and talked about Trump being a gracious host. And it's kind of remarkable. You don't know really which ones are more loathsome. The ones who stick with this hideous narrative that Donald Trump is a fascist and a Nazi, which was purely designed to retain power for their kind of people. We've had the leader of the Lib Dems in Britain stuck with that narrative, and he said, who are the third party in the UK. The leader of the Lib Dems reiterated this idea that Donald Trump is a Nazi. And I don't know which is more vile and dishonest, really. Someone like that who sticks with it after Trump's election, or someone who, like Lammy, immediately pretends that he never said any of this stuff.
Right. No, it's a funny thing. Saturday Night Live, which I don't watch, but I see clips, referred, 30 years ago, it might have been funny. The cast gets up there and they're all lamenting the election because they're, that's where they are. They're doing that honestly. And then 2 seconds later, they're like, but, now we support Trump, and, they please please don't come after us, as if censorship is something of the right, which I don't think it is here. And they do exactly that two-faced aspect. Well, and it doesn't even come off as a joke, but
one of the most remarkable things about it is that one of the explanations that they put forward for Trump winning is that the right has this vast network of influence that the left can't match, which is absolutely hilarious when you think, you've got diversity, equity, and inclusion, and economic, social, and governmental policies enforced on every business there is. Every corporation was on their side. Every social media platform apart from X was totally on their side. The whole of legacy media and all its power has been on their side for 8 years at least. And these people are still lunatic enough to think that they are the kind of brave rebels fighting the system and the man, when they've been the system and the man for a very long time now. And, and they've been censoring people and silencing people and working in collusion with the FBI and the Department of Justice to, lawfare people so that there can't be any opposition against them. And yet they still take away from that the idea that they're the victims and they're the ones who are fighting this vast network of power, you know. And it's absolutely ludicrous. They got Trump banned when he was the serving president, and they think they're the ones who have to fight the power. You know, that's how bad their level of delusion is.
Yeah, and mind you, X was only, you know, I'm not sure it's all the right, because it's a platform. It's kind of doing what the platform should do.
Yeah,
Like your telephone is not supposed to be political. It's supposed to be just a conduit. So that we have, I forget the number code, whatever. We have this code where if you're a newspaper, you're putting out editorial content. Um, but if you're a platform, then you're not judged based on your content. And so AT&T, a telephone company, whatever, doesn't get judged because people are on the phone talking about X, Y, or Z.
yeah,
And so that's been the case against libel and slander for Facebook and whatnot. But they on the other hand, put their huge weight on the side of censorship and discrimination in a sense. And so far as there's been a voice, it's only been in the last 2 years, perhaps, since Elon Musk took it over. And even then, once he stepped back from the major role and Linda Yaccarino took over like a year and a half ago, she said, you have the freedom of speech, not the freedom of reach. So on my tiny platform, I'm up to 7,000 followers, but I was at zero because I'd been off Twitter until Musk took over, because I had posts deleted and whatnot, and strikes and all that kind of stuff that YouTube and LinkedIn and Facebook had done to me for presenting the basic truth about COVID lockdowns and governmental overreach and all that kind of stuff. Everything grew, kind of exponentially for me while Musk was there. I went from 0 to like 5,000 in a couple of weeks, for like 3 months, and then it just stayed there ever since. It's just when Yaccarino took over, my numbers stayed pretty much at 5,000 for the duration, and so she turned the spigot off. So even on X, it was, you were allowed to say stuff, but it became balkanized and segregated according to your viewers and listeners. So they even had that. They even had X.
Well, if you think about it, I mean, this is what's so fundamentally dishonest about the arguments that have been made about media influence and social media influence, because lots of institutions in the Western world now are still trying to effectively say that social media companies have to act as a censorship arm of the state. And, that is pure fascism. If you outsource your censorship and your thought control of people to a corporation, that's the fascist alignment of corporation and state. That's exactly what Mussolini envisaged as fascism being. And this is the default position of the ruling elite class and the media class of what is normal and good now. Because like in Germany, there've been people who've been imprisoned, and there's a substacker called Eugippius who's really good on this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But there's people who've been imprisoned and arrested, and one of the things that's been cited in their cases has been criticism of the state and spreading a distrust in the state. Well, that's pure tyranny if you're not allowed to criticize the state. And if you're not allowed to criticize all these various globalist positions that transnational bodies and individual states want to adopt, if you're not allowed to question something like mass immigration and you risk being put in prison for questioning it, you're not living in a free country. You're not living in an open society. And the great contradiction of the globalist position is that they constantly claim to be the ones defending older liberal values, and they are the ones enacting fascist control of everything, including people's individual rights and individual thoughts. All directed by the state, all having to be submissive to the state, or else you're not allowed to speak, you're not allowed to talk, you might lose your job, you might have you might be unable to get a job in government or elsewhere. So there's rampant hypocrisy all the way through it, and there is a censorship complex. It's certainly not controlled by anyone on the right. You know, there are innumerable organisations now that have been set up by, you know, what we would once have called the left and is today globalism. And they are the ones in control of state-funded censorship networks and pressing for people's opinions and thoughts to be controlled on the basis of, we label that as misinformation or disinformation. And what they mean by misinformation is any information they don't completely control.
Yeah, it verges. It's you know, somewhere between authoritarianism and totalitarianism. Now, you know, you're a great writer. I think everyone should follow Jupplandia. I do. I subscribe, and I do it for the kickbacks mostly. But the great writing there. But I noticed your most recent piece is about a game I don't play. You can describe it, but they're not just happy enough having power. It has to be that, you know, they get your mind stuff, your amusements, the way you talk to each other. You know, they have to be at the, you know, dinner table. They have to be between you and your children. You know, the probably the greatest and most evil aspect of the totalitarian is to you know, I guess cut the family ties. You know, have the children turn into parents. And you know, it seems to me that there's no refuge, there's no place you can relax. And even though it's just a video game, or just, I mean, I'm sure people who do it would, you know, would not like that characterization. But can you talk about kind of that infiltration in BioWare, and you know, how that plays out, so that, you know, there has to be kind of an indoctrination throughout, you know, even in your
in a way, it's, you know, you can relate it back to what we were saying just a moment ago, because, you know, the thing with Twitter was that it was colluding with government and forcing a certain narrative and a certain set of opinions that favoured the globalist progressive causes and parties. And, you know, conservative people, libertarian people were being silenced and removed, and Trump supporting people, obviously. And what Elon Musk did is he didn't make X a right-wing platform. He just removed the suppression of right-wing content and removed the suppression of, you know, any voices that were non-globalist and non-progressive. And they're so used to enacting their power now that when it's a genuinely level playing field, they feel that that's unjust to them. You know, they when it's an even race, a competition of ideas with free speech, they consider that tyranny against them. But it isn't. And you know, with the popular culture, they've kind of tried to take everything and make every single thing that you will encounter in your society as a reflection of their values. You know, so if you want to watch the Super Bowl, you're going to get those ads and those messages and those, you know, songs that are pushing their narrative. You can't just go there and watch the Super Bowl, or you can't just switch on your telly and watch the Super Bowl and it's just about the sport. You know, it's got to be spreading their messages. So it's got to have a big pride flag there, or it's got to have, you know, a kind of all black troupe performing music beforehand, celebrating the Black Panthers. You know, you're not allowed any neutral spaces by these people. And in the gaming industry, what you've got, what my article on, there's this game called Dragon Age the Veilguard, and it's sold very badly, and it comes in a franchise called Dragon Age that previously sold very well. I think one of the earlier iterations sold 12 million copies or more. So it's a big deal in the gaming industry, this franchise. You know, it's like the computer gaming equivalent of a Marvel franchise. And BioWare was based on owning this franchise and a couple of other very popular ones like Mass Effect. They're a big name in the gaming industry. And what they did with this game is they spent 10 years developing it, and they invested, according to assessments in the Steam community and elsewhere, they spent about $250 million minimum developing this game, and that's before marketing costs, because they employed, possibly upwards of 200, 300 developers for 10 years making this game. And essentially it's been ruined because they fired a lot of the older developers in this process. They hired a lot of woke activists, including a lead designer who is trans. And they what was a kind of a fantasy adventure role-playing game, that people played in order to act out little heroes killing dragons and casting spells and doing the kind of things you expect from a fantasy genre, and they turned it into lectures on trans issues. So they added in a character who was called Taish, who is in the game there's this species called the Kunari, who are like ogres. But they're supposed to be a kind of warrior culture, and they're supposed to be, funnily enough, in the earlier lore of the game, they're supposed to be a species that is very conservative about gender roles, and assigns kind of your occupation is determined by your gender. So this is a medieval fantasy setting, and they picked a race that's kind of particularly conservative in a medieval fantasy magical setting, and then they made a character within that race, totally going against all the law that had been established, a trans activist, basically. And
actually, I think you're wrong. I think it's actually the same as Hezbollah and Hamas, which are medieval warrior cults, and they have all kinds of trans warriors. And
exactly. So they
promote.
took, I know, it's utterly absurd. They took this very very contemporary issue, this very contemporary set of attitudes that's particular to only a very small group of people, and not going to do well in their own fan base, because it's still the case that majority of gamers are straight males. It's men and boys that play these games in the majority. They're female gamers, and they've been accommodated, and there's strong female characters in there and stuff. And there are, plenty of female developers of games. And, there will be gay gamers, and there'll be trans gamers as well. But they basically made the whole game a lecture for the smallest group amongst those groups. And the level of bad writing that they went to with this, it's like, it offends me as a writer. Right. Not just if it was a completely different set of politics, I would still be offended by it, because it's so painfully bad, and it's done with no subtlety whatsoever. And they have a bit where this trans character comes into the scene, sits down at a table, and the first words are, "So I'm non-binary."
The old joke. How can you tell somebody's vegan?
You're the kind of helpless captive of this as a player, rather than being, I want to be controlling a little character who's actively doing heroic things, and that's why I bought this game. You're then forced to sit through discussions that last like 4 minutes or more about, the proper way to use someone's pronouns.
Yeah.
Completely, and it does the opposite of what a writer does. A writer might use their own experiences, but they translate those experiences into the setting they're portraying. And especially if you've got a fantasy setting, which requires a certain level of suspension of disbelief in the first place, because you've got dragons and you've got elves and you've got goblins, and it's unreal to begin with. But what makes it unbearably unreal is if you then use it as a sounding board for your very contemporary political attitudes. because who wants to hear a lecture on pronouns from a magical ogre? You know, I can't imagine that even a kind of trans player, really, unless they're kind of totally ideologically captured, wants to hear that and enjoys that and considers it what they're going to an adventure game for.
Yeah. Now, it's a few things run through my head. I'll try to list them quickly. Laura Ingraham, about 20 years ago, wrote a book, Shut Up and Sing. She had spent the equivalent of today's, $3,000 to go see one of the innumerable Barbra Streisand farewell tours. She did another. She kept having farewell tours, and this I think was the final one. And she got up there and regaled everybody about the evils of George Bush as Hitler or whatever. And Laura Ingraham took her revenge with Shut Up and Sing. Like, I paid the money.
Yeah.
Do your job. I'm a physician, and if somebody comes in for earwax or a sore throat, it's like, it's not my job to say, who are you voting for? What do you do? It's like, dude, just cut my hair, just clean my teeth, just do that. I'm not here for that. I'm not paying you for that. If I get an Uber, and we want to talk to X, Y, and Z, that's really the discretion of the customer. It's not the discretion of the driver. It's not for the driver to regale you and attack you, unless, of course, you're in Amsterdam. Which is
if you're in Amsterdam and Jewish, then it can happen.
I have to pop this in. So the Dutch have let in. I guess they didn't have their own native Uber drivers, so they have a lot of first, second generation Muslims and Turks, Moroccans, whatever. And this was apparently an Uber flash mob. They was all premeditated. They were on their own Signal or Telegram or WhatsApp channels, and they premeditated the attack, and they flash mobbed with their cars, and they used them as tanks to mow people down and all this kind of stuff. And so I had a picture of the Mufti of Jerusalem sitting down with Hitler, and I wrote for this Amsterdam event, I wrote Dutch land and their Uber drivers. So I wrote Dutch land Uber allies.
Very clever.
I know. I had to put that in.
Come into their own at some point, don't they?
Yeah, but it's just it's a funny thing. It just the same kind of bleed where they can't let you be happy. Bill Burr is a reasonable comedian. He also kind of failed on Saturday Night Live recently, trying to bridge the gap between his kind of hugely Trump hating. She actually gave the finger to Donald Trump behind his back. He's kind of an edgy comedian, and he should be a conservative in a better world, but he kind of identifies as of the left. He had a piece on the WNBA, and it's like, women, WNBA fails. That's because you're not watching. We already have our league. We just leave our sports alone. They have the women announcers. There can't be a panel among sports these days without a woman on it. Like, okay, all well and good. Every sideline reporter is a female or minority, and these jobs kind of get relegated. So it's just kind of an odd task. And while I'm bloviating here, 20 years ago, probably, we were at the airport, my kids and I and my wife, and there was a huge screen for ESPN, and there's a guy who's very mediocre looking, and glasses and scrawny, and he's talking about football. And I said, you guys stop, listen to this guy. He knows football. And they're like, Dad, how do you know he knows football? Who is he? I said, I have no idea. So how do you know he knows football? I said, well, he's not a football player. He's not filling any of these kind of like token gaps and so forth. So why do they have him on? They don't have him on for his looks. QED, he must know football. And it's kind of like, you can't have your own domain, and it kind of keep retrenching it. And anyway, so that's, one of these things where it's just, they can't let you have fun, because fun, you're having fun.
And popular culture as well. It's Puritanism, essentially. It's woke Puritanism that, as well as a kind of statist attitude that the state should be directing and controlling everything, including our thoughts and our fun.
Controlling, patrolling, and trolling.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And, but it's got to the stage now where they genuinely think if they're not allowed to control you, that means you're controlling them. The concept that there is this middle point where you both have some kind of autonomy, and you're not being, and it doesn't hurt them that they can't control what I'm allowed to say. You know, that concept doesn't arise to them because they've been trained to think that, well, no, unless you know, I control this space entirely, that's you oppressing me. And it's really, really bizarre. Like, you see the hysterical reactions to Trump's election, and you've got these people who are crying and weeping and wailing and acting hysterically, and they're so unaware of how this shows to people like us that they are the ones posting this. It's that, you know, if I was in that state, so for so little reason, I would not want it to get out. I'd be like,
Oh,
a week
absolutely.
later,
Like,
I'd be like,
that's
oh my
that's
god,
the stuff.
I was such a moron. What was I doing? And, you know, and that's embarrassing. And but they release it themselves, and you know, they dress up in the you know, the pilgrim clothes, as if they're, you know, as if there's going to be squads of Trump supporters who are going to be, you know, picking out their Stepford wives from these captured women and forcing them to have their babies, you know, and it's so bizarre and so disconnected from reality.
So
But the thing is, can I just relate it back to,
yeah.
they're like that about Trump getting elected, and the same people were kind of, you know, with the same politics, the same background, the same views, were looking at what happened on October the 6th in Israel and basically saying to Israel and to Jews everywhere, you know, why are you overreacting? You know, that when people were actually raped, when people were actually murdered, when there was real genocide, when there was, you know, the most hideous crimes against individuals, innocent individuals. And that, because of how brainwashed and deluded they've become, that was stuff that they said, you know, immediately forget about it. Don't try and get Hamas. Don't try and respond to that. You're actually the people in the wrong when you're the victims. And at the same time, all of these imaginary things, whether it's Trump being elected, which won't harm them, or whether it's, you know, climate change and the planet dying, they're terrified of imaginary things and they ignore real things.
No, you're absolutely right about that. I apologize for interrupting you earlier, but the thing that was popping into my head was this, I forget what they call it, 4B or something, movement, where they're shaving their heads and with you know, refraining from sex. You know, people have obviously made the point. It's like, well, if you can do that so, you know, easily and willingly, then, you know, why are you doing this over abortion? You know, which kind of puts it out of. But the thing I was going to ask you is, you know, isn't this kind of like an admission against interest? I mean, so much of it is, mind you. If there were no double standards, they wouldn't have standards per se.
Yeah.
But kind of like amongst these movement of women, they're basically saying that sex is their currency.
Yeah.
And I mean, it was always supposed to be, you know, we're all about equality. And I guess equality kind of on the male concept of, you know, work for your living, get your stuff, be responsible, get the same, you know, PhDs, MDs, education, blah, blah, blah. And we're all going to do the same, given that we're in a world where, you know, we're not actual warriors except on video gaming and whatnot. So, you know, we don't have to do the danger of jobs. We don't have to be in dangerous neighborhoods. You know, we are basically all just, you know, the same people. We're all NPCs together, I guess. But here it seems to be an admission against interest to say that, you know we have that thing you want, and we're going to hold it back because we're not really equal. You know, you desire us. You know, you are the guys. You pursue us, and we are, you know, basically, you know, kind of shape shifting in a way. We have makeup. We have the hairstyles. We have allure. We have, you know, fish lips. You know, all this kind of stuff. And we're going to take all that stuff away. We're going to put on face masks and be bald. No offense, but it's like, you know,
well, yeah, but I mean, it is terrible what you know, what final wave feminism reduces women to, because that's exactly it. They're saying, as their supposedly feminist rebellion, that the only currency they have is the vagina. The only currency they have is sex, and they're obsessed with, you've got things like the vagina monologues, and you've got nobody talks about vaginas more than feminists, and yet their basic argument is that men are only seeing them as that. Well, they're only seeing themselves as that, and when you vote for someone solely on the basis that they have the same private parts as you, you're the one with the problem, not anyone else. If you're saying, I have to vote for that person because, well, they've got the same genitals as me, how deluded, how messed up is that? And how far from, what feminism originally promised people that has become. And, this is also why they moved from the word equality to the word equity. And it's the same in gender as it is in race, because they achieved it. They there was a point, yes, historically, where we had a much more patriarchal society, and women in certain circumstances were treated unfairly. Okay, that's true. That did exist, and there was a time when ethnic minorities in the Western world had probably fewer rights than white people. These are indisputable historic facts. They're not exceptional historic facts, because at the same time, if you were in China, you would have had less rights than a Han Chinese person, or if wherever you were in the globe, you would have had less rights than the people who were controlling that nation. And it's still the case today. The only people who really significantly changed that and moved to real equality was the Western world. It was the Western world that came up with these concepts of equality and spread them and made them something effective. It was very rare in the ancient world. You didn't have that. You might have had individual examples of people like Ashoka the Great, who who decided against slavery, for example. But you didn't have this idea that everyone, no matter where they come from, should be considered equally. And you didn't have this concept of overarching human rights that apply to everybody. Those were all Western inventions, Judeo-Christian inventions. So it's kind of bizarre that we're in this place now, because the 4B movement is saying to women, you are only to be judged by your vagina. It's not Trump voters who are saying that. It's things like the 4B movement, who are effectively, and they've been using the insult incel towards men for ages, who say women have got too crazy, I'm pulling back from dating, I'm not going to bother trying. And those are like mainly men who are maybe not that good socially, maybe men who have been embittered by experiences, but they're being exactly the same, but somehow it's affirmative and valuable when they do it. They've been saying to men who withdraw from relationships and withdraw from dating because they think that the other gender has gone nuts, they've been saying for ages, you're loathsome and you're vile. And then they say, we're going to do that. It's a very, very odd thing. And it's also odd because they're doing this specifically in response to what they consider conservatives and a conservative vision of a woman's role in society. And they've effectively rediscovered modesty, which most conservatives were saying don't abandon in the first place. It's kind of good if a woman values herself and has a kind of pride in herself that means she doesn't kind of sleep with everybody at the drop of a hat. And they're saying we're going to stop sleeping with everybody randomly. Right. And they suppose that conservatives are going to be angry with that. We're not. We're going to be, okay, no, well, this is the route that is needed for modesty to come back. That's a good thing.
Yeah. So, I once heard the ice hockey theory of sexuality or gender roles. And so in ice hockey, you have your skaters and you have your goalies. And so they're all on the same team. They're all, human beings. And yet, to have a goal occur is a different occasion for, your centers and your forwards. They score a goal and the goalie lets in a goal. So if the goalie is, kind of involved with, scoring, that's in a bad way. And if the forwards are involved in scoring, that's a good thing. And those are different concepts. So, and then if you get to the dating scene, clearly, if a guy walks into a bar at 2 a.m. and, says, "Oh, I'm exhausted. I'd love to go home with, a beautiful woman," everyone just kind of like laughs. If a woman walks in and says, "Oh my God, I'd love to go home with a guy tonight," like, everybody wants to score. So they have different roles. So that clearly,
please don't make that movement again, though. It's a little bit disturbing.
Yeah. We do have, we're separated by a pond here. So,
I feel relatively safe.
so I'd like to talk about, this is concept of death by cop. Have you ever heard of that? Death by cop or death by constable.
Yeah.
There's a concept here that people, when they're suicidal, they put themselves in a certain way and they, act out, and then the police the police take their lives because whatever. So it's suicide by cop, by proxy. So to kind of conflate or contort that a little bit, this Peter Lynch hanging was, I guess, technically a suicide, but was that death by police state? And was that
it's an indirect murder by the British state, effectively.
So people here may not be aware. Peter Lynch was, kind of a famous stock guru here, but we're not talking about that Peter Lynch. Can you get us up to date on Tommy Robinson, Peter Lynch, the state of two-tier care?
Yeah, well, Peter Robson was a 61-year-old grandfather with angina and health issues, and Peter Lynch was a 61-year-old grandfather with these health issues. And what he did is that when we had the so-called Southport riots, which were exaggerated in the media, nowhere near on the scale of Black Lives Matter riots, even in the UK. But these were, protests that were supposed to have come from the right, supposed to be in response to the murder of 3 young girls who were, tragically and brutally killed. So in response to that, there was supposed to have been these right-wing protests. There's lots of factors about it that look dodgy as hell, to be honest, because it was left-wing organisations that were spreading the information, telling people where to gather and when to protest. It wasn't right-wing organisations doing that. The government blamed a right-wing organisation, the EDL, which years ago was led by Tommy Robinson, among others. The EDL has been defunct for years. So, that narrative, that story is a bit strange anyway. But regardless, what Peter Lynch did is he went to one of these protests. He had a banner calling the MPs and the Parliament corrupt, and he exchanged words with the police. He didn't do anything violent. He didn't break or damage any property. He didn't set fire to anything. He didn't offer physical violence to anybody. He didn't threaten anybody verbally. He actually said at the time that I'm doing nothing, meaning that he was doing nothing illegal. What he said was essentially that Muslims had raped women and girls in the UK, and the authorities had covered up for them and helped them. And he said to the police, you've helped them, you've aided and abetted this, in his own words, but that's pretty much the gist of what he was saying. Now, Peter Lynch came from Rotherham. Rotherham, there were at least 1,400 cases of exactly what Peter Lynch was describing had happened. Young girls were groomed and raped by Muslim gangs, and the authorities refused to respond to it for decades. So what Peter Lynch was saying was factually accurate. It was also stuff that was perfectly legal and should be perfectly legal for someone to say. You know, it might be unpleasant to hear for those who are the genuine guilty parties, but in a free nation, you should be legally able to say that your government or your police or your courts are corrupt. And you should be legally able to say that, Muslim grooming gangs raped young girls, because they did. It's all truthful information that he was imparting. And, we have, from inquiries that took place into the grooming gang scandal, we have confirmation that the authorities covered it up. And, Keir Starmer was someone involved in this himself. Keir Starmer was someone who was under the Blair government, Director of Public Prosecutions, who failed to go ahead with, or instructed lawyers under his command not to go ahead with, prosecutions of grooming gangs, of Muslim grooming gangs. The police at the time, were more worried about community relations, and people said this. So Keir Starmer is himself one of the guilty parties. That's not saying that Keir Starmer is a rapist. It's saying that his political actions helped Muslim rape gangs, and they did. These are just basic facts. His actions as Director of Public Prosecutions of failing to prosecute people for these crimes helped Muslim rape gangs get away with raping white children for decades. And the whole British political establishment has guilt to bear in relation to the grooming gang scandal. And that's what Peter Lynch was referring to. Now, what happened to Peter Lynch is that because there had been some level of disturbance and violence at some of these meetings, none of it involving Peter Lynch, but Peter Lynch was one of a large number of people who were dragged into it by the police over-responding, by the courts over-responding, and by Keir Starmer, our new Prime Minister, instructing the courts to go after everyone related to these riots. So even if you were just physically present there and you did nothing wrong yourself and nothing illegal yourself, your mere presence, and one of the judges involved in passing the sentences put this forward as if it's a legitimate point, your mere physical presence was taken as guilt, and you were prosecuted on that basis